The Maya by Dr. Michael D. Coe. Chapter 9, Maya Thought and Culture. Like all the indigenous populations of the New World, the Maya are a deeply spiritual people. All the students of the Maya, and anyone who has been among them for any length of time, can testify to this. Throughout the millennia, their thoughts and actions have been channeled by cosmological concepts of time and space, of the creation of sentient humans, as well as notion of the relation between the agricultural cycle, above all, that of maize, the staff of life, and the supernatural world. This is as true today as it was 15 centuries ago. The Maya definitely do not live by bread alone. It should be remembered that to the Mesoamericans, as well as to the civilizations of South and Southeast Asia, time is not linear, but cyclical. While we talk of the irreversible arrow of time, this is not the case among the Maya and the Aztecs, who have always thought in terms of cycles of creation and destruction. To them, our world is only one in a succession of universes, and while it is doomed to annihilation like its predecessors, creation will happen again and again. In the world at large, the ancient Maya are famed for their ability to predict eclipses and for their independent invention of the zero concept in mathematics. Although in almost all the early civilizations of which we have record, it is extremely difficult to separate primitive scientific knowledge from its ritual context. This should not lead one to suppose that a people like the Maya or the Sumerians had not evolved a considerable body of empirically derived information about the natural world. As we shall see, arithmetic and astronomy had reached a level only comparable to that achieved by the ancient Babylonians and surpassing in some respects that of the Egyptians, but one should not exaggerate. Science in the modern sense was not present. In its place we find, as with Mesopotamian civilizations, a combination of fairly accurate astronomical data with what can only be called numerology, developed by the Maya intellectuals for religious purposes. Nonetheless, our knowledge of ancient Maya thought must represent only a tiny fraction of the whole picture, for of the thousands of books in which the full extent of their learning and ritual was recorded, only 4 have survived to modern times, as though all that posterity knew of ourselves were to be based upon 3 prayer books and the Pilgrim's Progress. These are written on long strips of bark paper, folded like screens and covered with gesso. Pictorial representations on classic Maya funerary pottery show that in the classic times the codices had jaguar skin covers and were painted by scribes using brush or quill pens dipped in black or red paint contained in conch shell ink pots. According to the early sources, the Maya books contain histories, prophecies, songs, sciences, and genealogies, but our 4 examples are completely ritual or ritual astronomical works compiled in the northern area during the post-classic. The Dresden Codex is the finest and measures 8 inches high and 11 3/4 of a foot long. While some of its content was certainly copied from the late classic sources, some of the iconography of the Dresden that has been shown by Carl Tabby to be Aztec influenced, so that it must date in its present form to just before the conquest. The Madrid and the very fragmentary Paris codices are much poorer in execution than the Dresden, but probably similar in date. Thomson even suggested that a Spanish priest might have obtained the Madrid codex at Tayasal. Not impossible, since 2 of its pages apparently incorporate paper fragments with Spanish writing. In 1971, there was exhibited at the Grolier Club in New York a 4th Maya book which has since been labeled the Grolier Codex. It once belonged to a private collector in Mexico, and on circumstantial evidence, seemed to have been found in a wooden box in a cave near Tortuguero, Chiapas, within the previous 4 decades. Unfortunately, in very bad condition, it comprises about 1/2 of a 20-page table concerned with the Venus cycle. Although its authenticity was vigorously disputed by Thomson and others, the radiocarbon date of 1230 from its paper is fully consistent with the Toltec Maya style in which the glyphs and associated deities are drawn. It is now considered genuine by knowledgeable epigraphers, thus making the Grolier the earliest of the 4 pre-conquest Maya manuscripts. To these must also be added the classic Maya inscriptions, and then we have a great deal of very valuable information on Maya ritual in the early post-conquest accounts, and in various esoteric texts like the books of Ek Balam and the Popol Vuh, written in Maya but transcribed into Spanish letters. From all these documents, it can readily be seen that Maya life was deeply imbued with religious feeling, and that ritual behavior gave meaning and a sense of security to all strata of Maya society. The universe and the gods. As has been said, The idea of cyclical creations and destructions is a typical feature of Mesoamerican religions. The Aztecs, for instance, thought that the universe had passed through 4 such ages, and that we were now in the 5th, to be destroyed by earthquakes. The Maya thought along the same lines, in terms of eras of great length, like the Hindu Kapas. There is a suggestion that each of these measured 13 Baktuns, 5,125 and a quarter years, and that Armageddon would overtake the degenerate peoples of the world and all creation on the final day of the 13th. The great cycle would then begin again. Thus, following the Thomson correlation, our own universe would have been created on 4 Aha 8 Kumku, 130000, or August 13th, 3114 BC, to be annihilated on December 23rd, AD 2012, when the present cycle of the long count reaches completion. According to our post-conquest Maya sources, the last creation prior to our own ended with a great flood, a belief that is found among the Aztecs, at the end of which the sky fell on the earth, and there was no light. A kind of interregnum now ensued, a time of magic and heroic doings celebrating in the early chapters of the Popol Vuh, which tell the doings of the hero twins, see sidebar chapter 3. Before a new and more perfect world could be formed, the imperfections of the old one had to be expunged. In their book, Maya Cosmos, Linda Shell, David Friedel, and Joy Parker advanced a complex hypothesis concerning the next steps in creation. According to them, they are recorded on several monuments, including Stela at Quirigua, and on the late classic painted or carved vases. In darkness, because the sky is still lying on the earth, on 4 Aha 8 Kunku, the resurrected maize god, called Hum Ishim, one maize, in the classic texts, has been brought by a canoe propelled by 2 aged paddler gods to a special place in the night sky. There he set up 3 heart stones, to be seen as 3 bright stars in our constellation Orion. One of these is the jaguar throne, another is the snake throne, and a third the water lily throne. At the same time, in the northern sky within the Milky Way, he made a house of 8 partitions, perhaps representing the cardinal and intercardinal points, and raised a great world tree. And there he started these stairs in the monument so that they would perpetually revolve counterclockwise around the north celestial pole. And atop the world tree perched the principal bird deity, the classic counterpart of Wukub Kakish, now apparently revived to play a more positive role in our present universe. This scenario has yet to be universally accepted by Maya epigraphers. Among the Maya, the Milky Way is the role of dead souls into the underworld, as well as the path of those souls to the sky. It is thus no surprise to find sculpted on the sarcophagus lid of Pakal the Great, the 7th century ruler of Palenque, a representation of the dead king descending down the world tree into the gaping centipede jaws of Xibalba. Within his sarcophagus, however, he has been fitted with the green jade mask of the maize god, so presumably Pakal is also to be resurrected and will rise to a flowery paradise, Flower Mountain, through that same world tree. Each Maya capital city may have had its own variation on the basic creation myth, so as to glorify the putative ancestors of reigning monarchs. This is certainly the case with Palenque, and the tablet in which Pakal's son, Ek Balam, had placed in the Temple of the Cross. The opening clauses of the inscription take us back 8 years before the 4 Aha 8 Kumku creation event, to the birth of the first father, the maize god, and 540 days later to the birth of the first mother. From the latter are born Kawi'i, a snake-footed deity with smoking tube or axe fixed in the forehead, who acted as patron of the royal line throughout the Maya realm, and 2 enigmatic beings known in literature only as Gi and Giii. The Earth and the Gods. Maya notions about our own world are by no means simple to reconstruct from our very uneven data, but apparently they conceived of the Earth as flat and four-cornered. Each angle had a cardinal point which had a color value: red for east, white for north, black for west, and yellow for south, with blue-green at the center. It was supported by 4 aged Pawatuns, the quadripartite form of the old deity, who ruled over the days at the end of the year. The sky, in turn, was held up at the corners, according to Landa, by 4 Bacabs, Atlantean gods with the appropriate color associations. Alternatively, the sky was supported by 4 trees of different colors and species, with the blue-green ceiba or silk cotton tree at the center. Classic art and the post-classic codices suggest that the flat earth was also thought of as the back of a monstrous crocodile resting in a pool filled with water lilies. Its counterpart in the sky was a double-headed serpent, a concept probably stemming from the fact that the word for sky, ka'an or chan, is a homonym of the word for snake. Shell and her colleagues are surely right in thinking that this was the ecliptic, the apparent path of the sun, moon, Venus, and other celestial bodies, for their signs are marked on the serpent's body. Exceedingly little is known about the Maya pantheon. That their Olympus was peopled with a bewildering number of gods can be seen in the 18th century manuscript Ritual of the Bacabs, in which 166 deities are mentioned by name, or in the pre-conquest codices, where more than 30 can be distinguished. This theogonic or theogonic multiplicity results in part from the gods having many aspects. First, in the case of certain gods, each was not one but four individuals, separately assigned to the colored directions. Secondly, a number seem to have had a counterpart of the opposite sex as consort, a reflection of the Mesoamerican principle of dualism, the unity of opposite principles. Thirdly, some seem to have had young and old aspects, or especially in classic times, fleshed and fleshless guises. Fourthly, there was no clear dividing line between humans and animals, or even between species of animals, so that many supernaturals combined these elements in fantastic ways. And lastly, every astronomical god had an underworld avatar, as he died and passed beneath the earth to reappear once more in the eastern sky. While some Maya sources speak of the one and only god Unagu, who was incorporeal and omnipotent, this may be a concept introduced by the missionaries. The supreme deity was surely Itzamnachach, lizard house, pictured as an aged man with Roman nose in the codices, the inventor of writing and patron of learning and the sciences. His wife was Chakchel, Lady Rainbow, the old goddess of weaving, medicine, and childbirth. She was also the old moon goddess, and the snakes in her hair and the claws with which her feet and hands are tipped proved her equivalent to Coatlicue, the Aztec mother of gods and men. All the other gods, including the Bacabs, were apparently the progeny of this pair. It is these two who are the old progenitor couple described in the Popavu. The sun god, Genich Aha, is very similar to Itzam Naach in the codices, and may have been one of his aspects. On his night journey beneath the earth, he becomes the jaguar god of the underworld of fearsome aspect, often pictured on classic monuments. It is believed that a young, half-naked lady prominent in the Dresden Codex represents the young moon goddess, a youthful variant of Chakchel known as Ishchup, the woman, who has romantic dalliances with various gods. At the corners of the world resided the benevolent and quadripartite Cha'ak, the rain god, whose worship, as Carl Tabby has demonstrated, goes far back into Olmec times. Cha'ak was deeply venerated by the pre-conquest Maya, who saw him as manifested in thunder and lightning bolts, and is one of the very few deities whose cult has survived among the living Maya. There was also the quadruple Bacabs, each of whom presided over 1/4 of the 260-day period in turn. Another ancient weather deity was the wind god, the bearer of moisture to the sky, identified by the Ik wind day sign that appears somewhere on his head, and by the breath curls emanating from his mouth. Further, there were patrons of the classes and professions. Heading this list is Kukulkan, a god who succeeded Kwahuitl as presiding deity of the ruling caste. Introduced after the classic collapsed, his cult reached a peak in Toltec times. Several war gods were venerated by the soldiers, some of them clearly deified as heroes famed for their conquests. For the merchants and cacao growers, there was Ek whose blackface and Pinocchio nose. He also is of Central Mexican origin, succeeding in the role of patron of the merchants, the great classic deity known only to us as God El. But the latter was also a war god, and appears in this guise on the world destruction page of the Dresden Codex. There was also patron deities of hunters, fishers, beekeepers, tattoo artists, comedians, lovers, and even suicides. Assigned to the arts, such as music, dance, and writing and painting, were the monkey man gods whose origin story is so vividly recorded in the Popavu. The classic Maya underworld. The underworld, Xibalba, place of fright, to the Quiche Metnal, to the Yucatec, may have been multi-layered with 9 corresponding lords of the night, The several torture houses through which the hero twins and their progenitor had to pass suggest that this was the case. This cold, unhappy place was the final destination of most Maya after death, and though it passed the heavenly bodies such as the sun and the moon after they had disappeared below the horizon. We now know that one important function of classic Maya pictorial ceramics, whether painted or carved, was funerary, which is logical given that their final destination was as containers for food and drink, especially chocolate and maize tamales, in the tombs and graves of the honored dead. It is thus no surprise to find incredibly explicit pictorial references to the underworld epic on classic Maya pottery. The entire epic, of which the Popavu preserves only a fragment, must have been written in codices that would have been the equivalent of the Egyptian Book of the Dead. On vases and on plates, many of the dramatis personae familiar to us from the Popavu. The maize god, Wukukakish, the monkey man gods, and above all, Unapu and Shbalanque. The former recognizable from the black spots on his face and body, the latter from the patches of jaguar skin. Both these hero twins continue to play the roles of underworld gods well into the colonial period in the Maya highlands. Several late classic Maya vessels portray them in the act of resurrecting their father at the dawn of creation, and more than a few celebrate them as the quintessential ball players who beat the lords of Xibalba at their own game. Pictorial ceramics tell of a strange obsession of the classic elite. This was the taking of ceremonial enemas by means of a leather or rubber syringe bag fitted with a bone tube. The aged Pawatun himself was often the recipient of this treatment, administered at the hands of a beautiful young consort. The exact substance injected remains in doubt, but the vases show the liquid was kept in wide-mouthed jars and had froth on top. Accompanying glyphs suggest that this was the intoxicating chi drink, and we do know from Aztec accounts of the Huastec, linguistic relatives of the Maya, that those people habitually intoxicated themselves by the means of pulque enemas. On the other hand, Peter First has pointed to the widespread custom in lowland South America of administering powerful hallucinogens in enemas, and has documented the custom among the contemporary Huichol of western Mexico, who use the potent peyote or spineless cactus buttons for the infusion. Incidentally, the otherwise unexplained bone tubes found in classic Maya tombs and graves probably represented the surviving remains of the enema apparatus. Deep caverns have always been conceptual entrances to Xibalba for past and present Maya. One such cave, now named Nachtunik, was discovered in 1979 by local residents in Karst Turan near Poptun in the southeastern Peten. The cave is huge, measuring 2,790 feet deep along its longest passage. It has ancient walls, late classic burials, and terminal late preclassic pottery, but it was apparently thoroughly looted before archaeologists could get to it. The importance of Nachtunich lies in its extensive hieroglyphic texts, altogether comprising of about 400 glyphs and scenes, all executed in carbon black on the cave walls. The latter include depictions of the ball game, amorous activities that are probably of a homosexual nature, and Maya deities, which not unexpectedly include the hero twins, Hunapu and Xbalanque. The style of the writing and painting is closely related to late classic vases in codex style, and must have been carried out by one or more artists and scribes skilled in the production of Maya books. According to the inscriptions, Nachtunik was a pilgrimage site, not only for the scribes who wrote these texts, but also for the rulers in whose courts they served. But beyond their role as points of communication with the underworld, James Brady of George Washington University has told us that in the Maya mind, caves were intimately associated with mountains, and that it is in such caves that it was and still is believed that fertilizing rain is created before being sent into the sky. Even today, ceremonies are held inside them at the onset of the rainy season. Much of the Maya lowlands consist of limestone, karst terrain, and is honeycombed with caves. There is little doubt that the Preclassic and Classic Maya often took care to place their ritual structures over caves so that the temple pyramids and palaces could be validated and energized by them. During a 4-year project at Dos Pilas in the Peteshbatun region, Brady located 22 caves. One of them ran directly under El Duende, the largest pyramid in the city, and contained among its offerings Preclassic pottery. At the site of Oxquintoc in Yucatan, another survey discovered no fewer than 37 caves. In effect, they must exist wherever the underlying geology is karstic, but have eluded discovery because their entrances are often little more than small holes or depressions in the ground. Cenotes can also be considered caves, albeit with partially collapsed roofs, and many are known to be considered holy places by the Maya. Brady even suggests that Chichen Itza itself appears to be laid around two of its main cave features, the Xtolok cenote and the sacred cenote. Rites and ritual practitioners. In contrast to that of the Aztecs, the late post-classic Maya clergy was not celibate. Sons succeeded their fathers to the office, although some were second sons of lords. Their title, Akin, he of the sun, suggests a close connection with the calendar and astronomy, and the list of duties outlined by Atlanta make it clear that Maya learning as well as ritual was in their hands. Among them were computation of the years, months, and days, the festivals and ceremonies, the administration of the sacraments, the fateful days and seasons, their methods of divination and their prophecies, events and the cures for diseases, and their antiquities and how to read and write with the letters and characters. But they also kept the all-important genealogies. During the prosperity of Mayapan, an hereditary chief priest resided in that city whose main function seems to have been the overseeing of an academy for the training of candidates for the priesthood, but in no source do we find his authority or that of the priest superseding civil power. The priest was assisted in human sacrifices by 4 old men, called Cha'aks, in honor of the rain god, recalling the sacrificial role of the classic rain deity Cha'ak, who held the arms and legs of the victim, while the breast was opened up by another individual who bore the title of Nakom, like the ward leader. Another religious functionary was the Chilam, a kind of visionary shaman who received messages from the gods while in a state of trance, his prophecies being interpreted by the assembly priests. Every single Maya ritual act was dictated by the calendar, above all, the 260-day count. These sacred performances were imbued with symbolic meaning. Every single Maya ritual act was dictated by the calendar, above all by the 260-day count. These sacred performances were imbued with symbolic meaning. For instance, the numbers 4, 9, and 13, and the color directions appear repeatedly. Before and during rituals, food taboos and sexual abstinence were rigidly observed, and self-mutilation was carried out by jabbing needles and stingray spines through the ears, cheeks, lips, tongue, and the penis, the blood being spattered on paper or used to anoint the idols. On the eve of the conquest, such idols were censed with copal and rubber, as well as ritually fed. Human sacrifice was perpetrated on prisoners, slaves, and above all on children, bastards or orphans brought for the occasion. Nevertheless, before the Toltec era, animals rather than people may have been the more common victims, and we know that such creatures as wild turkeys, dogs, squirrels, quail, and iguanas were considered fit offerings for the Maya gods. Our understanding of the Yucatecan ritual round is crippled by Landa's sporadic inability to distinguish between what he called movable feasts, i.e. rites determined by the 260-day count, and those geared to the 19 months of the 365-day vague year. But apparently the greatest ceremonies had to do with the inauguration of the new year. These took place in every community within the Wayab, the 5 unnamed and unlucky days at the close of the previous year, and involved the construction of a special road, perhaps like the classic causeways, to idols placed at certain cardinal point just outside the town limit. A new direction was chosen each year in front of a 4-year counterclockwise circuit. There were all sorts of omens, good or bad, for every year, but an inauspicious augury could be offset by expiatory rites, such as the well-known fire-walking ceremony in which priests ran barefoot over a bed of red-hot coals. Throughout the year, there were agricultural rites and ceremonies for such important economic groups as hunters, beekeepers, fishermen, and artisans, probably geared to the 260-day count if we may rely on the testimony of the Madrid Codex, which seems mainly devoted to such matters. Increase of game, abundance of honey and wax, and so forth were the purpose of these activities, which so often take the form of the sympathetic magic defined by Sir James Frazer. For instance, compelling the rain to fall by having the Cha'aks empty water from pots onto a fire. Despite past claims that the classic Maya societies were organized as theocracies, that is, as states ruled by priests, there is not the slightest evidence for the existence of priests in classic times. It is entirely plausible that the office of priest was introduced to the Maya area in the early post-classic by the Toltecs. Thanks to recent decipherments of ceramic texts by David Stewart, Nikolai Grube, and others, we now know a great deal about classic scribes, painters, and sculptors, and their supernatural patrons, one howler and one monkey. They seem to have occupied the highest rank of ancient Maya society, for a highly talented artist/scribe of one vase ascribed to Naranjo is named as the son of the king of that city. And on another unprovenanced vase from the Peten, the king, Aha himself, seems to have been named as the scribe. Thanks to the practice of artists, both painters with brush pens and sculptors with carving tools, signing some of their works, we have several titles for such individuals. The most common are Atzib, scribe, painter, Yushul, his sculpting, a phrase found on both stone reliefs and uncarved pottery, and Itzat, wise, learn. At the top of the scribal hierarchy in the royal palace, and perhaps playing a role equal to that of the grand vizier in old world courts, was the official with the title Akuhun, literally he of the holy books, that is, the royal librarian, identifiable by his sarong, unkempt hair, wrapped in a headcloth, and bundle of what seemed to be quill pens or folded paper, tied to the forehead. The Akuhun probably oversaw all ritual activities in the kingdom, kept the calendar, made astronomical calculations, taught calligraphy in scribal schools, negotiated royal marriages and diplomatic treaties, and tallied tribute and other offerings. In short, in the hands of this official was all of the learning and sciences of the classic Maya. The classic elite were obsessed with blood, both their own and that spilled by high-ranking captives. Hieroglyphic and iconographic studies have shown that the supreme significance of ritually shed blood by the classic Maya rulers and their families. This was drawn at calendrically important intervals by men from the penis and from the tongue by their wives. The penis perforator was usually a stingray spine or bone owl and seems to have been ritually adorned and deified. Scenes on stelae once thought to have been concerned with water or maize kernels cascading from the lowered hands of rulers are now known to portray blood dripping from their mutilated members. Thus, blood signified noble lineage and descent, as it traditionally did in Europe. Numbers and the calendar. Otto Neugebauer, the historian of science, considered positional or place value numeration as one of the most fertile inventions of humanity, comparable in a way with the invention of the alphabet. Instead of the clumsy, additive numbers used by the Roman and so many other cultures of the world, a few peoples have adopted a system whereby the position of a number symbol determines its value, and consequently, a limited number of symbols suffices to express numbers, however large, without the need for repetitions or creation of higher new symbols. The Maya usually operated with only 3 such symbols: the dot for 1, the bar for 5, and a stylized shell for naught. Unlike our system adopted from the Hindus, which is decimal and increasing in value from right to left, the Maya was vigesimal and increased from bottom to top in vertical columns. Thus, the first and lowest place has a value of 1, the next above it the value of 20, then 400, and so on. It is immediately apparent that 20 would be written with a naught in the lowest place and a dot in the second. And what kind of calculations were made, and for what purposes? Landa says that the purely vigesimal notation was used by merchants, especially those dealing in cacao, and he mentions that computations were performed on the ground or on a flat surface, by means of counters, presumably cacao beans, maize grains, and the like. But the major use to which Maya arithmetic was put was calendrical, for which a modification was introduced. When days were counted, the values of the places were those of the long count, so that while the first 2 places had values of 1 and 20 respectively, the third was thought of as a tune of 360 days, 18 by 20, and so on up the line. For operating within their incredibly involved calendar, which among other things included the permutation of the long count with the 52-year calendar round, the Maya scribes found it necessary to construct tables of multiples. In the Dresden Codex, such tables include multiples of 13, 52, 65, 78, and 91, the nearest whole number approximating 1/4 of a year. Fractions find no place in their system. They were always trying to reach equations of cycles in which all numbers are integers. Example given: 73 by 260 days equals 52 by 365 days. There are several kinds of dates expressed on the classic Maya monuments and in the Dresden manuscript. Leading off a typical classic inscription is the initial series, a long count date preceded by an introductory glyph with one of the 19-month gods infixed. This is immediately followed by the day in which the 260-day count, and, after an interval filled by several other glyphs, the day of the month, 365-day count. The intervening glyphs indicated which of the 9 gods of the underworld is ruling over that day in a cycle of 9 days, and lunar calculations, which will be considered later. However, this is not the whole story, for there are usually a number of other dates on the same monument. These are reached by distance numbers, which tell one to count forwards or backwards by so many days from the base date, and while the intervals are usually of modest length, in a few examples these span millions of years. And then there are period-ending dates in the inscriptions, which commemorate the completion of a katun, half katun, lahatun, that is 10 runs, quarter katun, hotun, or tun. As an example, one might cite the katun ending 918,000, which was celebrated all over the central area. Anniversaries also dot the classic inscriptions. These are calendar-round dates falling at intervals of so many katuns or tuns from some date other than the above-mentioned period-ending dates. Why this apparent obsession with dating in the calendar? What do all the dates on the classic monuments mean? They were formerly explained as the work of priests working out the positions of calendrical and celestial cycles in a religion which was essentially the worship of time itself. As we shall see, an utterly different explanation is not only possible, but certain. The sun and the moon. To the Maya, the round of 365 days, 18 months and 20 days plus the extra 5 days of the Wayeb, was as close to the solar year as they cared to get. This vague year began among the Yucatan of Landestime on July 16th, Julian calendar. The Gregorian was not to appear until 1582. Yet the Earth actually takes about 365 and a quarter days to complete its journey about the Sun, so that the vague year must have continually advanced on the solar year, gradually putting the months out of phase with the seasons. We know that none of the Maya intercalculated days on leap years or the like, as we do, and it has been shown that more sophisticated corrections thought to have been made by them are a figment of the imagination. Yet their lunar inscriptions show that they must have had an unusually accurate idea of the real length of the tropical year. Curiously, the Maya went to a far greater trouble with the erratic moon. In the inscriptions, initial series dates are followed by the so-called lunar series, which contains up to 8 glyphs dealing with the cycles of that body. One of these records, whether the current lunar month was of 29 or 30 days, and another tells the age of the moon on that particular long count date. Naturally, the Maya, like all civilized peoples, were faced with the problem of coordinating their lunar calendar with the solar, but there is no indication that they used the 19-year Metonic cycle, on which a golden number in the Book of Common Prayer is based. Instead, from the mid-4th century AD, each center made its own correction to correlate the two. However, in 682, the scribes of Copan began calculating with the formula 149 moons equals 4,400 days, a system which was eventually adopted by almost all the Maya centers. In our terms, they figured illumination to average 29.53020 days, remarkably close to the actual value 29.53059. Of great interest to Mayanists and astronomers alike have been the eclipse tables recorded on 7 pages of the Dresden Codex. These cover a cycle of 405 luminations or 11,960 days, which conveniently enough equals 46 by 260 days, a kind of formula with which the Maya were deeply concerned, for such equations enable them to coordinate the movements of the heavenly bodies with their most sacred ritual period. The ancients had found out, at least by the mid-8th century AD, but possibly much earlier, that lunar and solar eclipses could only occur with plus or minus 18 days of the mode, when the moon's path crosses the apparent path of the sun. And this is what the tables are, a statement of when such events were likely. They also seem to have been aware of the recession of the node, or at least of its effect over long periods of time, and Eric Thompson suggested that the tables were constructed anew every half-century or so. The celestial wanderers and the stars. Venus is one of the only planets for which we can be absolutely sure the Maya made extensive calculations. Unlike the Greeks of the Homeric age, they knew that with the evening and morning stars they were dealing with the same object. For the apparent or synodical Venus year, they used the figure of 584 days. The actual value is 583.92, but they were close enough. Divided into 4 periods of varying length, Venus as morning star, disappearance at superior conjunction, appearance as the evening star, and disappearance at inferior conjunction. After 5 Venus years, its cycle met with the solar round. For 5 times 584 equals 8 times 365, 2,920 days. Such an 8-year table can be found in the Dresden Codex and in the Grolier Codex. Some have questioned whether the movements of the planets other than Venus were observed by the Maya, but it is hard to believe that one of the Dresden tables, listing multiples of 78, can be anything other than a table for Mars, which has a synodic year of 780 days, or that the Maya intellectuals could have overlooked the fact that 117, the product of magic numbers 9 and 13, approximates the length of the Mercury year, 116 days. These Maya savants were, of course, astrologers, not astronomers, and all these bodies which were seen to wander against the background of these stars must have influenced the destiny of prince and pauper among the Maya. With the correlation between the Christian calendar and the Maya long count now fixed, it should be possible, by consulting modern astronomical tables, to test the hypothesis long held by David Kelly that the classic Maya inscriptions contain references to heavenly bodies above and beyond the lunar data, which customarily follow initial long count dates on the Maya stela. The late Floyd Lounsbury of Yale found confirmation of this hypothesis at the famous site of Bonampak, renowned for its murals. The long count position of the date associated with the great battle scene corresponds to August 6, AD 792, Gregorian. The tables tell us that this date was marked by the inferior conjunction of Venus, by a zenith passage of the Sun as it passes directly overhead on its way to its winter home, and by the conjunction of Venus with the star Regulus. That Venus played a sanguinary role among the Maya is similar to that of Mars in the Western Old World that can be seen in the glyph for a war, a Venus sign over another element, sometimes the emblem glyph of the site attacked. The date selected by the Bonampak astronomers for this martial action was, in the words of Professor Lounsbury, apparently seen as a propitious date for the undertaking, the outcome of which was to confirm the opinion. Likewise, the first visibility of Venus as the evening star on December 3rd, AD 735, set off an attack on the southern Peten side of Cibal by Dos Pilas, leading to the capture of its ruler the next day. This unfortunate was kept alive for another 12 years, finally being sacrificed at a ritual ballgame timed for an inferior conjunction of Venus. Star Wars indeed. Jupiter was also taken into account by the classic Maya. The accession at age 49 and the apotheosis 21 years later of the great Balenque ruler Ek Balam was set by the planet's second station, the end of its retrograde or east-to-west movement against the background of these stars. And most recently, the art historian Susan Milbrath has suggested a connection between this planet and the supernatural patron of royal lines, Cahuil. The astronomer Anthony Avini and the architect Horst Hartung have determined that the ancient Maya used buildings and doorways and windows within them for astronomical sightings, especially of Venus. At Uxmal, for instance, all buildings are aligned in the same direction, except the house of the governor. A perpendicular taken from the central doorway of the structure reaches a solitary mound about 3.5 miles, or 5.6 kilometers away. Venus would have risen precisely above the mound when the planet reached its southerly extreme in AD 750. In collaboration with Sharon Gibbs, they have shown that in the case of the Caracol at Chichen Itza, the whole building is aligned to the northerly extremes of Venus at about 81,000, as is a diagonal sightline in one of the windows of the tower top. Another diagonal sightline matched the planet's setting position when it attained its maximum southerly declination. The Babylonian and Egyptian astrologers divided up the sky in various ways, each sector corresponding to a supposed figure of stars so as to check the march of the sun as it retrogrades from sector to sector through the year, and to provide a star clock for the night hours. The zodiac of Mesopotamia is the best known of such systems. Did the Maya have anything like it? On this subject, there was previously little agreement, but Linda Shell, David Kelly, and their colleagues are now convinced of its existence. The subject is indeed complex. As we have seen, the Maya conceived of the Milky Way as both a great world tree with its crocodile-headed base in the south, and as the mystic road along which souls walk into the underworld. Crossing the Milky Way at the constellation Scorpio, seen as a scorpion by both the Maya and ourselves, is the ecliptic, the apparent path of the sun, moon, and planets as they move against the background of the stars. In Maya iconography, the ecliptic appears as a two-headed sky serpent, its body marked with astronomical signs. A stylized form of the creature can be seen in the ceremonial bars carried by classic rulers. It has been recognized for years that two much damaged pages of the Paris Codex show a scorpion, a peccary, and other beings pendant from the sky serpent, and similar series appears sculpted on the nunnery at Chichen Itza. From Bishop Landa's account, We know that the Yucatec Maya called the zodiacal constellation Gemini, aka Peccary, just one of a number of clues that the zodiac was present among these people. The nature of Maya writing. Notable advances have been made in epigraphy and in the decipherment of the Maya writing system, but if by decipherment we mean the matching of a sign or sign group to a specific sound or word in the ancient language, then probably only about half of the script has actually been broken. Nonetheless, at this point in time, we certainly understand the meaning of many more glyphs with some precision, even if we do not always know how they were pronounced in Maya. This means that the ancient Maya are now the only true historical civilization in the New World, with records going back to the 3rd century after Christ. A half-century ago, however, it could honestly be said that few studies had made such little advancement with so much effort as the decipherment of the Maya script. This is not to say that a great deal was not understood, but there is a difference between unraveling a meaning for a sign and matching it with a word in a Mayan tongue. Progress was most rapid on those glyphs that were mainly calendrical or astronomical significance. For instance, by the mid-19th century, the Abbé Brasseur de Bourbourg had discovered Landa's relation, from which was able to recognize day glyphs and interpret the bar and dot numeration in the codices. It was quickly discovered that Maya writing was to be read in double columns from left to right and top to bottom. At the turn of the century, all the following had been correctly deciphered by scholars in Europe and America: the 0 and 20 signs, the world directions and the colors, Venus, the months also in Landa, and the long count. In a remarkable collaboration between astronomers and epigraphers, the mysteries of the lunar series had been unveiled by the early 1930s. But after these intellectual triumphs, fewer and fewer successes were scored, leading to a few pessimists such as Sylvanus Morley and Eric Thompson to the quite unfounded claim that there was little else in these texts but calendrical and astronomical mumbo-jumbo. It is generally accepted among linguists that all true writing systems express the utterances of a particular language. Earlier generations of scholars once held that some early scripts, such as Chinese and Egyptian, were ideographic in that they expressed thoughts directly without the intervention of language, but this has proved to be a delusion. All, we now realize, have a strong phonetic component. They denote sounds, no matter how pictorial some of the signs may look. Yet, even in heavily phonetic scripts, including our own alphabetic one, there are some signs, for instance, our mathematical notation, which are purely semantic and can be read in any tongue on earth. True writing emerged simultaneously with the evolution of complex societies in various parts of the Old World. All these early scripts are simultaneously logographic and phonetic. That is, they have a large number of logograms, signs standing for parts of words or, less commonly, whole words, along with phonetic and semantic meaning signs to help in their reading. In logophonetic writing, semantic and phonetic elements are usually complexly intertwined, sometimes in a single hieroglyph or character, and the logograms themselves require a certain degree of memorization, so such scripts were always more easy to read than to write. In Chinese and in ancient Sumerian, the auxiliary semantic signs accompany logograms or phonetic signs to indicate the class of things the referred items belong to, such as wood, water, and so on. These are not used in some scripts, but phonetic signs are universally employed to indicate the pronunciation of a logogram. For instance, in writing the Maya word wits, mountain, the scribe often prefixed to the logogram for the word syllabic sign we. Behind the phonetic signs in all logophonetic systems is the principle of the rebus. While many logograms may have originated as pictures of actual objects, as in Egypt and China, most of the nouns and verbs in a language are more abstract and thus not so easily visualized. But here, the scribe could take a pictorial logogram and exploit it for its sound value alone, as the sign for fire could be utilized in English as a sign meaning to fire or sack a subordinate. As children, we have all run across such examples of rebus or puzzle writing as "I saw Aunt Rose," expressed by pictures of an eye, a saw, an ant, and a rose flower. The Mixtecs and Aztecs used such writing to record personal and place names, and it was apparently the only kind of script they knew. In many ancient logophonetic scripts, the phonetic component takes the form of a syllabary, in which each sign represents a complete syllable, usually a consonant followed by a vowel, although each of the pure vowels will have its own sign. This is the case with the kana syllabary of Japanese, which gives the grammatical endings for the Chinese-derived logograms expressing word roots. Some people have eschewed logograms altogether or relegated them to minor importance, and have constructed totally syllabic systems. Two of the most famous examples are the linear B syllabary of Bronze Age Greece and the Cherokee syllabary invented in the 19th century by the Sequoia. The ultimate reduction to an almost but never completely phonetic script is the alphabet, perfected by the Greeks from a script handed to them by their Phoenician trading partners in the eastern Mediterranean. In the alphabet, most of the phonemes of the language, the smallest distinctive units of speech, become separately indicated instead of appearing together as syllables. With these preliminary remarks, what kind of a system do we then find in the Maya script? Bishop Landa has given to us his famous alphabet in which some 29 signs are presented. Several extremely distinguished Maya scholars stumbled badly in trying to read the codices and the inscriptions with Landa's treacherous ABC, while some went so far as to declare it a complete fraud. A more careful examination suggests that this is really not an alphabet in the usual sense. For instance, there are 3 signs for A, 2 for B, and 2 for L. Secondly, several signs are quite clearly glossed as syllables of the consonant vowel sort, i.e. ma, ka, and ku. We shall consider this important point later. After the almost complete failure of decipherments among these strictly phonetic lines suggested by the Landa alphabet, a diametrically opposite line was taken by Eric Thompson and many others, namely that the script was purely ideographic, with perhaps a few rebus signs embedded in the text from time to time. That is to say, any one sign could have as many reference or associations as the priest could think up, and that only they could read the holy signs, which in general character were more ritualistic than linguistic. There is a striking resemblance between this position and that of the would-be deciphers of the Egyptian script before the great discoveries of Champollion. This resemblance was not lost upon the Russian epigrapher Yuri Norosov, a student of Egyptian hieroglyphic writing. In 1952, he began publishing a series of studies which reopened the question of the Landa alphabet and the possibility of phoneticism in the Maya script. About 287 signs, not including variants, appear in the codices. If the system were completely alphabetic, then the language of the text would have contained this many phonemes. If purely syllabic, then there would have been about half this number of phonemes. Both are linguistic impossibilities. On the other hand, if all signs were semantic, representing units of meaning only, then the script represented an incredibly small number of ideas, certainly not enough for civilized communication. With this in mind, Norosov presented convincing evidence that the Maya were writing in a mixed logophonetic system in which phonetic and semantic elements were combined as in Sumerian or Chinese, but that they also had a fairly complete syllabary. Norosov's starting point was that Landa's ABC. Thompson had already demonstrated that the bishop's native informant had mistaken his instructions, that is, he gave the Maya sign not for the letter itself, but for the names of the letters. See, for instance, the first B, which shows a footprint on a road. Road is be in Yucatan, and this is exactly what the Spaniards called that letter. But the point is that this is really a partial and much flawed syllabary, not an alphabet. And Norosov was able to show that words of the very frequent consonant-vowel consonant CVC sort were written with 2 syllabic signs, standing for CV, the final vowel, usually but not always the same as the first, not being pronounced. The proof of phonetic syllabate writing is, of course, in the reading, and a number of Norosov's readings have long been confirmed by the context in which the signs appear in the codices, especially by the pictures which accompany various passages of text. If this were all that needed to be done, it would be a very simple job to read the Maya hieroglyphs, but the semantic dimension is very much there. Phonetic complements were often attached to logograms to help in their reading, either as by the prefix as a representation of the initial sound of the sign, or postfix as the final consonant. The recognition of these has notably advanced the process of decipherment. Phonetic redundancy of this sort was already being practiced in the classic. For example, David Kelly was the first to notice that the second part of the name of the great Palenque ruler Pacal could be written either as a picture of a hand shield, Pacal, in Maya, or phonetically as Pacala, or both. Epigraphers actively search for such substitutions, for that is a basic way that we learn how the logograms were actually pronounced. Although ridiculed by Thomson and his followers, Nosarov's logosyllabic approach is now universally utilized by Maya epigraphers. This is the way the script works. Since the initial work of Nosarov and Kelly, the recognition of phonetic construction in the script has proceeded at such a pace that epigraphers are now in general agreement over over 140 signs that have phonetic value. Some of them, of course, variations on one and the same syllabic sign. It is also now recognized that in Mayan, as in many ancient scripts, a number of signs are polyvalent, that is, a particular sign may have more than one phonetic reading. It may also be read for its logographic value. For example, in English, the compound sign ch has totally different values in the words chart, chorus, and chivalry. As each new phonetic decipherment has been made, we have been brought closer to identifying the language of the inscriptions and of the surviving books. As has been said in Chapter 1, this has turned out to be Cholti, a now extinct member of the Cholam branch of Mayan. Even the inscriptions of Chichen Itza seem to be written in Cholti. But what about Yucatec Mayan? To the ancient scribes, this apparently lacked the literary prestige of Chotli, although some Yucatec spellings are found in the Dresden and Madrid codices. Even further, the name of Pacaus the Great's son is written as Cambalam rather than in Cholam, Chanbalum, a wrong spelling found in the earlier editions of this book. All four codices deal exclusively with religions and astronomical matters, as is quite obvious from the pictures of the gods associated with the texts, from the tables, and from the high frequency of passages geared to the 260-day count. Thus, we have in these texts little more than short phases of esoteric significance, which often seem to match passages in the books of Chilambalam. History graven in stone. What then of the subject matter in the inscriptions? Until quite recently, the prevailing opinion was that this was in no way different from that of the books, and further, that all those dates recorded on the monuments were witnesses to some sort of cult in which time periods themselves were deified. The great John Lloyd Stephens was of a different mind, writing about Copan. One thing I believe, that its history is graven on its monuments. No Champollion has yet brought them to the energies of his inquiring mind. Who shall read them? The discovery within the last few decades of the historical nature of the monumental inscriptions has been one of the most exciting chapters in the story of New World archaeology. It began in 1958, when Heinrich Berlin published evidence that there was a special kind of sign, the so-called emblem glyph, associated with specific archaeological sites, and recognizable from the same kind of glyphic elements which appeared affixed to each. Thus far, the emblem glyphs for over 30 classic centers, including Tikal, Piedras Negras, Copan, Quirigua, Cibal, Naranjo, Palenque, and Yaxchilan, have been surely identified. Berlin suggested that these were either the names of the cities themselves or of the dynasties that ruled over them, and proposed that on these stela and other monuments of these sites their histories might be recorded. Thanks to the research of epigraphers Peter Matthews, John Hustison, and William Ringel, we now know what the emblem glyphs really are. They are the titles of Maya kings describing each other as the Kuhu-Aha, or Holy Lord of a kingdom, whose name appears as the main sign of the glyph. The next breakthrough was by Tatiana Proskoriakov of the Carnegie Institution, who analyzed 35 dated monuments from Piedras Negras. The arrangement of stela before structures she found was not random. Rather, they fell into 7 groups. Within a single such group, the time span covered by all the dates on this stela is never longer than an average lifetime, which immediately raised the possibility that each group was the record of a single sign. This has now proved to be so. The first monument in a series shows a figure, usually a young man, seated in a niche above a platform or plinth. On this stela, 2 important dates are inscribed. One is associated with a glyph like an animal's head with a toothache, and has been shown to record the accession to power of the young man. The other appears with the up-ended frog glyph, and is that same person's date of birth. Later monuments in a particular group celebrate marriages and the birth of offspring. And Proskoriakov was able to identify the signs for personal names and titles, particularly of women who are quite prominent in classic Maya sculpture. Military victories were also marked with great frequency, especially if an important enemy happened to be taken captive by the ruler. Thus, virtually all the figures that appear in classic reliefs are not gods and priests, but dynastic autocrats and their spouses, children, and subordinates. As the records for one reign come to an end, the next begin with the usual accession motif. Among the more complex documents which we have for the temporal dynasties which ran the ancient Maya centers are the inscriptions carved on the many stone lintels of Yaxchilan. From these, Proskoryakov reconstructed the history of the extremely militant dynasty that ruled the site in the 8th century AD. The record begins with the exploits of a lord whom she called Shield Jaguar. He was succeeded in AD 752 by his son, Bird Jaguar. As an example of how much of the writing that accompanies the reliefs celebrating the victories of this ruler can now be read or at least interpreted, we have lintel 8 of Yaxchilan, which begins with a calendar round date falling into AD 755. Below this, Norosov's Chukash, or capture glyph, then a glyph resembling a jeweled skull, which is obviously the name of the prisoner on the right. Above right, the second glyph is that of a bird jaguar himself, the figure with the spear, beneath which is the emblem glyph of Yaxchilan. Of special interest are those inscriptions that indicate the interference of some centers with the destinies of others. For instance, the Yaxchilan emblem glyph appears with one of the most prominent women in the Bonampak murals, and thanks to a royal marriage, the glyph for Dos Pilas appears on monuments at Naranjo. Piedras Negras is not far downstream from Yaxchilan, and the famous panel 3 from that side is now believed to show a royal visitor from Yaxchilan in attendance at a council called in the late 8th century to choose a successor to the Piedras Negras throne. As we shall see below, this interference took on major dimensions in the affairs of a number of cities in the southern lowlands. In 1973, Linda Shell and Peter Matthews were able to announce at a conference in Palenque that they had worked out the dynastic record of all the Palenque rulers going back to AD 465. This record has since been extended as far back as AD 431, the accession date of Palenque's first ruler by them and Floyd Lounsbury. Thanks to their research and to more recent readings like those of David Stewart, we can now place such important figures as Pakal the Great and Ek Balam in relation to the stupendous art and architecture that was created for them. Palenque, like Yaxchilan, had entered into the realm of history. Important glyphs, now known to relate to dynastic affairs, include the signs for events such as battles, the star shell, and other glyphs, inauguration or seating in office, ritual bloodletting, and death and burial, in addition to the birth and accession glyphs. As one would expect with ruling families obsessed with noble lineage and marriage affiliation, there are a number of relationship glyphs which have now been recognized, such as child of father, child of mother and wife, Atan and Maya, as well as a sign expressing the relationship, unpleasant in the extreme, between a local dynast and an important captive whom he had taken. Maya's superstates. As the decipherment has evolved, ideas of how the nature of the classic Maya political system in the central area have also been modified. Sylvanus Morley had thought that there had been a great political entity which he called the Old Empire, but once the full significance of the emblem glyphs had been recognized, it was clear that there never had been any such thing. In its stead, Mayanists proposed a more balkanized model, in which each city-state was essentially independent of all the others. The political power of even large entities like Tikal would have been confined to a relatively small area, the distance from the capital to the polity's borders seldom exceeding a day's march. When it became known that warfare between polities was frequent, the main motivation behind these activities was not believed to be control and territorial aggrandizement, but the need for royal captives destined for humiliation and sacrifice. Based on a better understanding of classic texts, particularly verbs relating to royal actions, Simon Martin and Nikolai Gruba have come up with a model that lies somewhere between an imperial and a Balkan one. Basically, we now know that not all Maya polities were equal. As Stephen Houston has discovered, the kings of some lesser states were said to be possessed by the rulers of more powerful ones. The phrase, "Ye aha, his king," gives away the relationship. Likewise, royal investitures in such vassal states were sometimes witnessed and therefore validated by the foreign divine ruler to whom they owed allegiance. Other forms of dominance dependence relationships included royal visits, gift-giving, joint ritual activity, and marriage. While city-states such as Palenque, Copan, and Piedras Negras exercised considerable political control over wide areas beyond their borders, the two superpowers were Tikal and Calakmul, the latter being the largest of all Maya cities, and it is hardly surprising to find that they were bitter enemies throughout much of the classic history. As testified by diplomatic activities, Calakmul had extensive influence over Cancuen, Piedras Negras, Dos Pilas, El Peru, Naranjo, and Caraco, a large and fluctuating alliance directed against Tikal. Calakmul's ability to wage war was formidable. In AD 564, it attacked Palenque, 150 miles to the southwest. In 631, it conquered Naranjo, far to the southeast, and in the year 657, Tikal itself. Tikal finally had its revenge on August 5th, 695, when forces under its great king Hassa Chan Kawi'il defeated Calakmul and captured its king Yicha'ak Kak, Fiery Claw, a triumph recorded on the wooden lintel of Temple 1, under which Hassa Chan Kawi'il is interred. By the 8th century, the age of superstates was over. No longer could a few powerful polities have hegemony over others. As the system broke down, an intense military rivalry among lesser states sprang up, and the Maya lowlands became truly balkanized. Spiraling interregional warfare and its attendant miseries and disruptions, for which the Betesh Batun sites give ample testimony, were surely factors in the ultimate breakdown of classic Maya civilization. History and the supernatural. If the inscriptions are largely about history, then why the lunar series and the calculations far into the past and future? Because the classic Maya elite believed in astrology and must have consulted their scribes for lunar and other cosmic auguries at every important civil event, as did the Babylonians, Etruscans, Egyptians, and many other peoples of the Old World. There is a logic to astrology which not only the ancients have found compelling, Kepler and Newton did likewise, so we need not condemn the Maya for their beliefs. Another Maya concern was with royal lineage, and we find figures and dates on some monuments that can only refer to distant ancestors. Thus, Berlin showed that in the dates in inscriptions of the Temple of the Cross at Palenque fall into three groups. The first are so ancient that they could only be referring back to the deified ancestors of a legendary epic, immediately before and just after creation. The next may have to do with distant progenitors of a more intermediate time, and the third are connected with contemporary historical events. The tablet of the Temple of the Cross celebrates the accession to the Palenque throne by Ek Balam following the death of his father, Pakal the Great, in AD 683. Now, Pakal was born on a day Aha in the 260-day count. The very earliest date on the tablet is 3,722 years earlier, and also falls on a day Aha, which in itself is suspicious. Floyd Lansbury has demonstrated that on this initial date, a mythical ancestor seems to have been born. But in addition, the interval between her putative birth and that of Pakal, 1,359,540 days, is an integral multiple of 7 different important Maya periods, including the synodic period of Mars. It is inescapable that the initial date was thus contrived to fit the needs of numerology and astrology, thus intertwining religion, genealogy, and history in the characteristic Maya style. Name tagging. In recent decades, a group of young epigraphers has forged ahead with the new readings that throw light on an entirely unexpected areas of ancient Maya culture. One of these has come to be known as name tagging, the labeling of objects with their names and with the names of their owners. The first known case of this concerns a pair of ground obsidian ear spools from a classic period royal tomb at Altuna, Belize. Peter Matthews shows that the text incised on each read Utup, his ear spool, followed by the ruler's name. In 1972, I discovered that there is a formulaic, repetitive hieroglyphic text on classic Maya ceramics, usually placed below the rim, which I christened the primary standard sequence, or PSS. I hypothesized that this was some sort of funerary chant, since these vessels are almost always in burial contexts, but a younger generation of Mayanists has found otherwise. Stephen Houston, David Stewart, and Carl Tobey have shown that a part of the PSS describes the form of the vessel as well as its contents, such as chocolate or sakul, a white maize gruel. This breakthrough received striking confirmation with an unusual screw-top jar from an early classic tomb at Rio Azul. The painted text on it said that it contained chocolate, written kakawa or cacao, and subsequent tests carried out by the Hershey Company proved that this had indeed been the case. On a few Maya vases, the classic artist scribes went one step further, by signing their own works of art, a custom otherwise known in Mesoamerica. David Stewart, who made this remarkable discovery, has gone on to find the signatures of individual sculptors on card reliefs from several Usumacinta cities. In some instances, a number of artists work on the same relief, which they all sign in their distinctive hands. Among the ancient Maya, it seems artists and scribes belonged to a high stratum of rigidly ranked society. Name tagging was not confined to portable objects only. The Maya who lived in these cities named many other things in the man-made and natural worlds. At Copan, for example, it had been found by Linda Shelley and David Stewart that stela, altars, buildings, plazas, sections of cities, and even complete cities receive proper names. Berlin had posed the question of whether the main signs of emblem glyphs are toponyms or the names of ruling lineages. There are now cogent reasons to think that the former is the case. In fact, toponyms have now been found to be widespread in Maya inscriptions of the Classic period, and not just in emblem glyphs. There are even toponyms for supernatural places, such as the Three Stone Place, which saw the first monument of creation, and a mysterious, probably sinister location known as Black Hole. Spiritual alter egos. This new generation of epigraphers has opened a window into the supernatural world of the Maya by another decipherment. The glyph in question appears often in ceramic texts as something possessed by holy lords, that is, rulers of cities. It is read as a way, rhymes with English why, a term that remains in use among many Maya groups for an individual's alter ego, spirit, or coessence, conceived as an animal counterpart which might be anything from a jaguar to a mouse. According to these ceramic texts and accompanying images, each ruler had such a Y, often fantastic chimera combining the features of 2 or 3 animals, with whom he was in a kind of special relationship. Y has a further meaning of sleep in some Mayan tongues, and it is possible that such mystic contacts were made in dreams. It is certainly suggested that a few inscriptions point to certain classic buildings as sleeping places, where Maya kings may have sought out these spirits, like the vision quest of native North Americans. The Great Maya Decipherment is a continuing process, and as it progresses, we are taken step by step even further into the mythological and supernatural world that was so important to the ancient Maya. The work of dedicated epigraphers, linguists, and iconographers has put us in touch with realms of Maya thought and behavior that were undreamed of by earlier generations of archaeologists, and has established a bridge to the lives and thoughts of those millions of modern Maya whose culture has survived centuries of oppression. This concludes Chapter 9.